screech of metal and the crash of splintered wood marked the end of Mary's so-called veranda on the water. From his dock, Frank Miller, retired engineer and newly elected mayor, watched calmly as the crane tore it apart, while police officers placed his raging neighbor under arrest. This wasn't a war he wanted, but it was one he was forced to finish, and Frank Miller always finished what he started. Tap like, subscribe for more stories where karma does its work, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. 6 months earlier, Frank Miller's world was measured in the scent of sawdust and the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore. Retirement, after 40 years of designing bridges and municipal infrastructure, wasn't an ending for him. It was a beginning. It was the freedom to pour his expertise into projects for himself, for his home. He'd bought this lakefront property years ago, a quiet little slice of heaven that had been his escape from blueprints and budget meetings. Now, it was his full-time sanctuary. His first project, the one he'd been sketching on napkins during city council meetings for the past year, was a new dock. The old one was a relic from the previous owner, a rickety skeleton of pressure-treated pine that groaned under his weight. Frank envisioned something better, something solid, a testament to his life's work. Built with the precision of an engineer and the soul of a craftsman, he chose cedar for its resilience and its rich, earthy aroma, and designed a structure that was both elegant and brutally strong, with reinforced concrete footings sunk deep into the lake bed. As mayor, a role he'd reluctantly accepted because he believed someone with common sense needed to do it, he made sure every permit was filed, every I was dotted, and every T was crossed with the local planning commission. It was, by the book, a perfect structure. The work was his therapy. Each morning, he'd wake before the sun, the smell of fresh coffee filling his small kitchen. He'd carry his mug down to the water's edge and just watch the mist burn off the lake. Then, the labor would begin. The rhythmic rasp of a handsaw cutting through a cedar plank, the satisfying thud of a hammer driving a galvanized nail home, the precise whine of his power drill. He wasn't just building a dock. He was reclaiming a part of himself that had been lost in conference rooms and bureaucratic tangles. This was tangible. This was real. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with a practiced confidence. He remembered his father, a master carpenter, telling him, "A man's character is in his work. Do it right, or don't do it at all." Frank was doing it right. He measured every angle twice, ensured every board was perfectly level, and even routed the edges of the handrails to make them smooth to the touch. The project became a quiet spectacle for the neighborhood. People would wave from their boats, and his immediate neighbors would often stop by to admire the progress, complimenting the craftsmanship. It was a peaceful process. A man in his element, creating something of value and permanence in the quiet corner of the world he called home. The tranquility of Frank's project was a fragile thing, though he didn't know it yet. His neighbor to the west was Mary Fitzwilliam, a woman who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. She was the self-appointed queen of the Lakeside Homeowners Association, a position she wielded not like a public servant, but like a feudal lord. Her own house was a sterile, oversized beige box, surrounded by a lawn so aggressively manicured it looked like a sheet of green plastic. Mary drove a white luxury SUV that was always immaculately clean, and seemed to glide down the gravel road with an air of silent judgment. Frank's first notable interaction with her had been a month after he was elected mayor. She had cornered him at the local grocery store to complain for 20 minutes about the unacceptable 10-mile-per-hour speed limit on their shared private road, insisting it should be 5, and that he, as mayor, should install speed bumps that she personally approved. Frank had listened patiently before explaining that the road was private and therefore outside the city's jurisdiction, a fact she dismissed with an indignant huff. She carried herself with the unshakable belief that the world was her personal stage, and everyone else was just a poorly rehearsed background actor. The day Frank drove the final screw into the last cedar plank was a day of deep, personal pride. He stood back, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow, and admired his handiwork. The dock stretched out over the water, a warm, reddish-brown structure that was as beautiful as it was robust. The solar-powered lights on the posts gave a soft glow as dusk began to settle. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was perfect. And that, it turned out, was the problem. The screaming started the next morning. It wasn't a cry for help or a shout of surprise. It was a shrill, sustained, nails on a chalkboard shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. Frank was on his porch, enjoying his coffee, when the sound ripped through the morning calm. He looked over toward Mary's property. There she was, standing on her own decaying dock, a figure of fury in a pink tracksuit, one arm pointed accusingly at his new creation. "An inch," she screeched, her voice cracking with vitriol. "That is at least 1 inch longer than the Ho guidelines allow. And that color. It's an obscenity. It ruins the entire natural vistas." It was a tantrum of such epic, childish proportions that for a moment, Frank was simply stunned into silence, coffee mug halfway to his lips. Frank's first instinct was one of bemusement. He was the mayor. He dealt with unreasonable people as a matter of course. He'd sat through 4-hour council meetings about the placement of a single park bench. He'd been cornered in the hardware store by citizens with passionate, if unhinged, theories about zoning ordinances. A screaming neighbor, while unpleasant, was just another Tuesday. He lowered his mug, took a deep breath, and decided on the path of least resistance. He would ignore her. Surely, she couldn't keep this up. It was absurd. He retreated inside, turned on the radio to a classic rock station, and tried to focus on the newspaper. But her voice was persistent, a piercing drone that wormed its way through the double-paned windows. He could hear her ranting about property values, about the visual pollution, about his flagrant disregard for community standards. He assumed she was performing for an invisible audience, that she would eventually run out of steam. This was the classic strategy of a bully, after all. Make a lot of noise, intimidate, and expect the other person to cave, just to make it stop. But Frank wasn't the caving type. He had overseen the construction of a multi-million-dollar suspension bridge that came in under budget and ahead of schedule. He wasn't going to be rattled by a woman in a pink tracksuit. Later that afternoon, while trimming the hedges that separated his property from his other neighbor, Mr. Henderson, the old man shuffled over. Arthur Henderson was in his late 80s, a retired history professor with kind eyes and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. He'd lived on the lake for 50 years and had seen it all. "Morning, Frank," he said, leaning on the handle of his rake. "Heard a bit of a commotion earlier." Frank chuckled grimly. "You could probably hear it on the other side of the lake, Arthur. My new neighbor seems to have some strong opinions about my dock." Arthur's smile faded. He looked over his shoulder toward Mary's house, his expression turning serious. "Be careful with that one, son," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She's not a stray dog that will wander off if you ignore it. She's a weed, Frank. A patch of Japanese knotweed. You can't just cut the top off. If you don't pull her up by the roots, she'll just keep growing back, stronger and more tangled, until she's strangled everything good around her." The old man's words, delivered with the quiet gravity of long experience, settled on Frank with an unexpected weight. It was a stark and unsettling metaphor, and it would stick with him for the days to come. The next day, Mary was back at it, as if she had simply paused overnight to recharge her lungs. This time, however, she had an upgrade. Around 8 a.m., the screeching started again, but now it was amplified, distorted, and 100 times more invasive. She had a megaphone. Frank was inside, trying to read a book on local history, but the sound was inescapable. "Attention, Frank Miller!" The tinny, robotic voice boomed across the water. "You're unpermitted. Garish structure is in direct violation of Har Covenant 7b4. Remove it immediately or face the consequences." The peace of the lake was not just shattered, it was methodically dismembered. Birds took flight from the trees. A family fishing in a small boat 100 yards offshore quickly reeled in their lines and motored away. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. This was a public nuisance. It was harassment. And it was an outright lie. His dock was not only permitted, he'd had the plans pre-approved by the HOA board itself, a process that had happened months before Mary had seized power in a contentious election. She was banking on the idea that no one would check, that her volume would substitute for facts. It was a declaration of war, broadcast for the entire neighborhood to hear. On the third morning, When the amplified screeching started up again right as the sun was clearing the trees, Frank knew that his strategy of passive resistance had failed. Mr. Henderson's words echoed in his mind. Pull her up by the roots. Ignoring the weed was just giving it more time to spread. As he stood at his kitchen window, watching Mary pace her shoreline like a sentry on a mission of madness, something shifted inside him. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, methodical resolve. He was Frank Miller, the man who built bridges, not the man who hid from bullies. And he was the mayor. His job, the one he swore an oath to uphold, was to maintain the peace and enforce the laws of the community. What Mary was doing was a violation of noise ordinances, at the very least. But more than that, it was a violation of the simple, unspoken contract of neighborly decency. He decided then and there that this would not be a screaming match. It would not be a petty, back-and-forth squabble. He was going to handle this the way he handled every complex engineering problem. With research, with precision, and by using the established rules of the system to achieve the desired outcome. He wasn't going to fight her on her terms. He was going to bring the full, dispassionate weight of the rule book down upon her. His first move was not to confront her, nor was it to call the police about the noise. That would be messy and subjective. He needed something concrete, something official and unimpeachable. He needed a paper trail that started with him being completely in the right. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. Dave? Frank Miller. How's the inspector life treating you? Dave Reynolds had been the city's lead structural inspector for 20 years and an old friend of Frank's from his early days in municipal engineering. They'd shared countless coffees over site plans and building codes. Frank. Mr. Mayor, Dave's voice boomed over the line. Same as always, making sure things don't fall down. What can I do for you? Frank's tone was all business. I need you to do me a favor, Dave. I need an official inspection. On my property. There was a pause. Your property? Frank, you designed half the buildings in this town. I'm pretty sure you know the code better than I do. That's not the point, Frank said, his eyes drifting to the window where Mary was still visible, megaphone in hand. I need it on the record. I want a full top-to-bottom inspection of my new dock. I want an official report, signed and stamped. I want it to be the most scrutinized, by-the-book dock in this entire county. Dave was silent for a moment, then let out a low whistle. Sounds like you're building a case, not a dock. I'm just making sure things don't fall down, Dave, Frank replied, echoing his friend's words, in every sense of the phrase. The next afternoon, Dave's official city truck, with its municipal seal on the door, pulled into Frank's driveway. Dave got out, clipboard in hand, looking professional and slightly amused. All right, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Laff, he said with a grin. Let's see this supposed code violation. Frank led him down to the dock. From across the property line, Mary watched, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. She probably thought this was the result of one of her dozens of calls to City Hall, a belief that suited Frank's purpose perfectly. Let her think she was winning. The inspection that followed was a masterclass in thoroughness. Dave, knowing what Frank was up to, was meticulous. He measured the width of the planks, the spacing between the balusters on the railing, and the height of the dock above the water line. He took out a voltage meter to check the electrical work for the solar lights. He even had a small underwater camera on a pole that he used to inspect the concrete footings and the galvanized steel brackets holding the structure to the lake bed. He spent nearly an hour going over every inch of Frank's work. Frank simply stood back, hands in his pockets, answering questions factually when asked. All the while, Mary looked on, her smug expression slowly beginning to falter as she saw Dave nodding in approval, making positive notes on his clipboard. 2 days later, the official report arrived in the mail. It was a clean bill of health, as Frank knew it would be. In fact, Dave had included a handwritten note at the bottom. Frank, this thing is over-engineered to the point it could probably serve as an aircraft carrier. If every structure in town was built this well, I'd be out of a job. Armed with the official, stamped, and signed document, Frank walked over to the edge of his property. Mary was there, watering her petunias with a venomous glare. Mary, he said, his voice calm and even. He held out the folder containing the report. This is the official inspection report from the city. It confirms my dock meets or exceeds every single city and state code. I thought you'd want to see it, so we can put this whole matter to rest. Mary looked at the folder he was offering as if it were a dead rat. She didn't take it. She just stared at him. Her eyes narrowed. I don't need to see your forged documents. Frank, she sneered. I know a violation when I see one. The HOA will handle this. And with that, she turned her back on him. Frank stood there for a moment, the folder still extended. He sighed, placing it back under his arm. This was the moment his strategy pivoted. It was no longer about proving he was right. It was about proving she was wrong. As Frank walked back to his house, the official report feeling heavy in his hand, a memory of his father surfaced, clear as day. They were working on the family's old Ford pickup truck, Frank, just a teenager, struggling with a rusted bolt. He was getting frustrated, ready to just get a bigger wrench and break the thing off. His father had stopped him, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Son, he'd said, his voice quiet but firm. Don't fight the bolt. Understand the bolt. Some things you can't force. You gotta use penetrating oil. A little heat. A little patience. You use the rules of how things work to your advantage. And some people, he'd added, looking his son straight in the eye, are just like rusted bolts. They won't listen to reason. They won't bend. They only understand the language of consequences. They only move when they realize staying put is more painful than letting go. Mary was a rusted bolt. She had rejected reason, rejected facts, rejected a peaceful resolution. Now, all that was left was penetrating oil, a little heat, and the unavoidable language of consequences. He was done trying to talk to her. It was time to start dismantling her. That evening, Frank saw Mr. Henderson out by his mailbox and decided to take a more direct approach. Arthur, he began, you were right about Mary. I tried the reasonable approach, and it didn't work. The old man nodded slowly, his eyes full of a sad understanding. Reason is a language she doesn't speak, Frank. Her native tongue is power. Frank leaned against the split-rail fence. You mentioned she's done this before. Tell me more. I'm not just her neighbor anymore. I'm the mayor, and this has become a city issue. Bolstered by Frank's official stance, Mr. Henderson finally opened up. He recounted the story of the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 2 kids who had moved in a few years ago. Mary, as HOA president, had forced them to repaint their house 3 times, claiming the shade of beige they chose was too vibrant. They eventually ran out of money and patience and moved away. He told Frank about Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow whom Mary had fined $200 a month because her bird feeder was attracting undesirable sparrows instead of acceptable cardinals. The stories painted a grim picture of a woman who weaponized petty rules to terrorize her neighbors, deriving a sick pleasure from their compliance and suffering. As Mr. Henderson talked, a crucial detail emerged. The thing is, Frank, he said, lowering his voice again, she enforces these rules on everyone but herself. She's had all sorts of work done over there. Put in that big, ugly retaining wall a few years back. Had a generator pad poured, and that dock of hers. But it was old when I moved here 50 years ago. She had some fella come out and patch it up about 10 years back, but it was all done on a weekend. No city trucks, no permits on the window, nothing. A light bulb went on in Frank's mind. The perfect irony. The woman screaming about his perfectly legal, fully permitted dock might be sitting on a throne of her own code violations. This was the root Mr. Henderson had spoken of. It wasn't just her personality, it was her hypocrisy, the foundation of her illegitimate authority. Her power came from the belief that the rules didn't apply to her. Frank was about to teach her, in the most official way possible, that they did. He thanked the old man for his time, a new, much sharper plan beginning to crystallize in his engineer's brain. This chess game was about to get interesting. The next morning, Frank made another call to Dave, the city inspector. He didn't mention Mary by name. He framed it as a procedural question befitting a new mayor trying to understand the system. Dave, hypothetical for you, he started. Let's say a citizen has a concern about a potentially unsafe structure on a neighbor's property. Say, a dock, or a retaining wall that looks like it's about to collapse. What's the protocol for that? Dave explained the process clearly. It's simple, Frank. The citizen files a formal complaint with the planning department. It can even be anonymous. They just need to state the address and the nature of the safety concern. Once we have a formal complaint in the system, we are legally obligated to investigate. We'd send a notice to the property owner and schedule an inspection. We can't just go snooping around on a whim. But a legitimate safety complaint gives us the legal authority we need to go have a look. Frank listened, absorbing every word. An anonymous complaint, legally obligated to investigate. The gears were turning. This was the mechanism. This was the penetrating oil his father had talked about. He wasn't going to be the one to swing the hammer. He was just going to set the gears of the city's own machinery in motion and let them do the work for him. With a clear path forward, Frank's entire demeanor shifted. The stress and annoyance were replaced by a focused, clinical determination. This was now a project, no different than designing an overpass. It required research, documentation, and flawless execution. He spent the next week in the evenings poring over city ordinances, zoning maps, and the Lakeside HOA's own labyrinthine book of covenants and bylaws. He cross-referenced aerial photos of the neighborhood from the county assessor's website, comparing images from 10 years ago to today. He saw it immediately. The new retaining wall, Mr. Henderson mentioned. A large shed that wasn't on the older photos, located suspiciously close to the property line. And of course, the dock, which even in the grainy satellite images looked haphazard and dangerously asymmetrical. He downloaded every document, highlighted every potential violation, and organized them into a digital folder on his computer labeled Project Knotweed. He was building a case file, just as a prosecutor would, ensuring every claim he made would be backed by indisputable evidence. He was no longer just a retired engineer. He was an investigator, meticulously laying the groundwork for Mary's self-inflicted downfall. The next phase of his plan involved mobilizing the silent, fearful majority. He started taking evening strolls around the neighborhood, deliberately timing them for when people were out watering their lawns or getting their mail. He didn't bring up Mary directly at first. He'd just ask how they were doing, talk about the weather, and mention his own recent disagreement about his dock. That was all it took. The floodgates opened. People, seeing that the mayor himself was in the tyrant's crosshairs, felt emboldened. The first to crack was Maria Rodriguez, the young mother whose family had been forced to repaint their house into submission. She invited him into her kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled a thick file folder from a drawer. "I kept everything," she whispered, her voice a mix of fear and defiance. Every threatening letter, every fine notice, every picture of the paint samples she rejected. She slid the folder across the table to Frank. It was a treasure trove of documented abuse, a perfect record of Mary's pattern of harassment. "Please," Maria said, looking at him with desperate eyes. "Do something. We can't afford to move again." Frank looked down at the folder, then back at her. "I will," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I promise." Maria's courage was contagious. Once word got out that Frank was quietly gathering information, his phone started ringing. It was like a dam had broken. One neighbor, an accountant, had been meticulously tracking the HOA's finances and had serious questions about where the money from all of Mary's arbitrary fines was going. Another, a retired plumber, told him about the time Mary had an illegal sewer line extension put in for a new pool house, a job done by a non-licensed crew in the middle of the night. Each story was a new piece of the puzzle, a new nail in the coffin he was patiently building for Mary Fitzwilliam. He listened to every single person, taking detailed notes on a legal pad. He advised them on how to document their own experiences, telling them to save emails, take pictures, and write down dates and times of every interaction. He was no longer a lone actor. He was becoming the leader of a quiet rebellion, rallying a community that had been silenced by fear for far too long. He was giving them a voice, and a strategy. The rallied community was forming, and their collective weight would be far more than Mary could withstand. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank's Project Knotweed folder grew from a collection of his own research into a comprehensive dossier on Mary's reign of terror. He had copies of a dozen threatening HOA letters sent to various residents, photographic evidence of her unpermitted construction projects, and signed affidavits from 3 different neighbors detailing her verbal abuse and intimidation tactics. The accountant neighbor had even found evidence that Mary was using HOA funds to pay for the landscaping on her own property, a clear case of embezzlement. The case was no longer just about a crumbling dock and a noisy neighbor. It had blossomed into a full-blown conspiracy of abuse of power, harassment, and potential criminal activity. Frank realized this was bigger than he had imagined. Mary wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a symptom of a sickness in their community's leadership. A sickness he, as mayor, was now obligated to cure. He felt the weight of his office settle on him in a new way. This wasn't personal revenge anymore. This was his duty. The time for reconnaissance was over. It was time to act. Frank sat down with Mr. Henderson at the old man's kitchen table. "Arthur," he said, laying out a simple, pre-filled-out form. "This is a formal complaint to the City Planning Department. It outlines concerns about potential safety hazards at 114 Lakeview Drive, specifically the structural integrity of the dock and the retaining wall." He slid the form across the table. "The city is legally required to investigate any formal complaint. It can be filed anonymously. No one will ever know who sent it." Mr. Henderson looked at the form, then up at Frank. His hand, wrinkled with age, was steady as he picked up a pen. "She's been a shadow over this neighborhood for too long, Frank," he said quietly. "It's time for a little sunshine." He signed his name at the bottom with a firm, deliberate stroke. "Let's not make it anonymous," the old professor said, a defiant spark in his eye. "Let's make it official." Frank smiled. The first shot had been fired, not with a megaphone, but with a pen, a piece of paper, and the quiet courage of a good man who had finally had enough. A week later, a certified letter from the City of Lakeside Planning Department was delivered to Mary Fitzwilliam. Frank knew the exact moment it arrived because the renewed screaming could be heard all the way down the block. A few minutes later, she was on his lawn, waving the letter in her hand, her face a mask of incandescent fury. "You did this!" she shrieked, stabbing a finger in his direction as he calmly watered his rose bushes. "This is a gross abuse of your mayoral power, a politically motivated witch hunt. You can't just have your cronies inspect my property because you're angry about my legitimate complaints." Frank carefully turned off the hose, setting it down on the grass. He faced her, his expression unreadable. "Mary," he said, his voice level and devoid of emotion, "a formal safety complaint was filed by a citizen of this town. The city's planning department, which is an independent body, is legally obligated to investigate it. As mayor, my only involvement is to ensure that our city employees are allowed to do their jobs without interference. It's the law." His calm, bureaucratic response was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The fact that he wasn't yelling, that he was simply quoting procedure, seemed to drive her into an even deeper rage. She sputtered, speechless for a moment, before storming off, vowing to call her lawyer and end him. Mary's attempt to intimidate Frank had the opposite effect. Her public tirade on his lawn, witnessed by several other neighbors, only solidified their resolve. She was predictable. When cornered, she attacked. Frank, meanwhile, remained a pillar of calm. He didn't react. He didn't engage. He simply stated the facts. He was playing chess while she was flipping the board over. He knew her next move would be to try and block the inspection, to use her lawyer to tie things up in legal knots. But he was prepared for that. He had already had a quiet word with the city attorney, giving him a heads-up and a brief, confidential overview of the mountain of evidence he had collected. The city was on solid legal ground. The inspection was not retaliatory. It was a response to a legitimate, documented safety concern filed by a taxpayer. Mary's blustering and threats were meaningless. She was a bully who had only ever encountered victims. She had no idea how to deal with a target who not only refused to flinch, but was using the system against her more effectively than she ever had. Her power was an illusion, built on fear, and the illusion was beginning to crumble. The day of the inspection was a major event on their quiet street. Dave Reynolds arrived with 2 junior inspectors, their official city vehicles parked conspicuously in front of Mary's house. To maintain the appearance of impartiality, Frank made a point of leaving his house for a few hours, heading into his small mayoral office at City Hall to handle some paperwork. The details of the inspection were relayed to him later by Dave over a beer. Mary, as expected, was hostile from the start. She demanded to see warrants, which Dave calmly explained were not necessary for a code compliance inspection prompted by a safety complaint. She followed them around her property, recording them on her phone and muttering about lawsuits. But Dave and his team were professionals. They ignored her and focused on the job. They started with the dock, and according to Dave, it was immediately clear that this was not a simple repair job. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The entire structure was a monument to negligence and dangerous shortcuts. The final report, which Dave walked Frank through later that day, was even more damning than they had anticipated. The dock's pilings weren't pressure-treated and were riddled with rot below the waterline, on the verge of collapsing. The electrical wiring, run for a set of garish party lights, was housed in indoor-grade conduit, a severe shock hazard just inches from the water. The decking was a patchwork of different woods, many of them not rated for outdoor use, creating an uneven and treacherous surface. Most critically, the entire structure had been built without a single permit on file. It was an illegal, uninspected, and imminently dangerous structure. Dave's professional opinion was blunt. It's not a question of if it will collapse, Frank, but when. And God help anyone who's standing on it when it does. The report recommended immediate condemnation and demolition. It was no longer a matter of fines or repairs. It was a public safety emergency. Mary's most prized possession, the symbol of her lakefront status, was officially a piece of junk. But the inspection didn't stop at the dock. Once on the property, the team was obligated to note any other visible code violations, and Mary's property was a veritable buffet of them. The massive retaining wall, built to create a higher, flatter lawn for her, was constructed with railroad ties, a material explicitly forbidden by city code due to the creosote leaching into the lake. Worse, it lacked proper drainage, and the inspectors found evidence that it was causing significant soil erosion on Mr. Rosen, Henderson's property next door, a clear violation of property law. The large shed in the backyard was built directly on the property line, a zoning violation. The new pool house that the plumber had mentioned, its plumbing and electrical systems were a DIY nightmare, completely unpermitted and dangerously substandard. It was a cascading failure of compliance. Mary, the woman who would fine a neighbor for a non-regulation mailbox, had a property that was a virtual encyclopedia of code violations, each one a testament to her belief that she was above the very rules she so gleefully enforced on others. The official order from the city was delivered to Mary's front door by a uniformed courier the following Monday. It was a thick packet of paper, meticulously detailing every violation. It included a cease and desist order, legally forbidding anyone from setting foot on her dock, which was now marked with bright yellow caution tape. It contained a list of a dozen other violations that carried hefty daily fines until they were brought into compliance. And, printed in bold, underlined letters on its own page, was the demolition order. It stated that due to the immediate and severe safety hazard posed by the dock, the structure was to be professionally demolished and removed at the owner's expense within 30 days. If the owner failed to comply, the city would hire a contractor to do the work and place a lien on the property for the cost. It was a comprehensive, legally airtight declaration of war, and every word of it was a direct consequence of her own actions. Frank pictured her reading it, her world of petty tyranny crumbling around her, and he felt not a shred of sympathy. He only felt the cold, clean satisfaction of a well-oiled machine doing its job. Mary's reaction was, predictably, volcanic. The entire neighborhood was treated to a day-long symphony of her rage. There was screaming, the sound of things being thrown inside her house, and a series of frantic, hysterical phone calls made from her front porch. Frank, sitting in his quiet living room, could hear her shouting at her lawyer, at the city planning department, and at anyone who would listen. Her threats escalated from lawsuits to vows of biblical retribution. She was a cornered animal, lashing out wildly in every direction, unable to comprehend that her usual tactics of intimidation were having no effect. The system she had tried to weaponize was now aimed directly at her, and she had no defense against it. Her power had always been a bluff, and the city, under Frank's quiet guidance, had just called it. The community, which had once cowered in fear of her outbursts, now just shook its heads, a quiet, collective sense of justice beginning to bloom on the shores of the lake. The Queen was being dethroned, and the spectacle was riveting. A few days later, a crisp, pompous-looking letter arrived at City Hall from a high-priced law firm in the city. It was full of blustering legal jargon, accusing the city of targeted harassment, abuse of power, and a litany of other baseless claims. It threatened a multi-million-dollar lawsuit if the orders were not immediately rescinded. Frank walked the letter down the hall to the office of the city attorney. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah. She read the letter, a small smile playing on her lips. She looked up at Frank. "Is this everything?" she asked. Frank slid a thick, 100-page binder across her desk. It was Project Knotweed, containing all the evidence he had gathered. The neighbor testimonies, the photographic evidence, and the financial discrepancies from the HOA. Sarah spent a minute flipping through it, her eyebrows rising slightly. She closed the binder and looked at the lawyer's letter again. "I'll handle this," she said with a grin. "This is going to be fun." The city's official response, drafted by Sarah, was a masterwork of legal smackdown, systematically dismantling every one of the lawyer's claims with cold, hard evidence and citations of municipal code. Mary's legal threat had vanished into thin air. With her legal options exhausted and the demolition deadline looming, Mary finally snapped. Her arrogance and rage curdled into a desperate, irrational need for revenge. She couldn't attack the city, so she decided to attack the man she blamed for it all. In the dead of night, dressed in dark clothing, she crept onto Frank's property. She clutched a can of glossy black spray paint, its ball rattling softly with each stealthy step. Her target was the source of all her problems. Frank's perfect, beautiful dock. If her dock had to come down, she would make sure his was ruined first. It was a petty, childish act of vandalism, the last resort of a bully who had lost all control. She crept down the grassy slope to the water's edge, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and vindictive glee. She raised the can, ready to deface the smooth cedar planks, to leave her ugly mark on his pristine creation. She had no idea she was walking straight into the final perfectly laid piece of Frank's trap. Frank had anticipated this. He knew Mary was irrational and vindictive. He knew that when every other avenue was closed to her, she would resort to something stupid and criminal. A week earlier, he had discreetly installed a series of high-definition, night vision security cameras around his property. They were small, hidden in the eaves of his house, and nestled in the branches of a large oak tree overlooking the dock. The moment Mary set foot on his lawn, a motion sensor was tripped, and the cameras began recording in crystal-clear 4K resolution. The system sent a silent notification to Frank's phone, but he didn't even look at it. He was fast asleep. He didn't need to watch it live. He trusted his planning. The camera in the oak tree had a perfect, unobstructed view. It captured everything: her shadowy figure creeping across the lawn, the can of spray paint in her hand, the moment she stepped onto his dock, her face clearly illuminated by the faint moonlight reflecting off the water. It recorded the sound of her shaking the can, a sound full of malicious intent. It was irrefutable, undeniable proof of her crimes. The next morning, Frank woke up at his usual time, made his coffee, and sat down at his computer. He watched the footage from the night before, not with anger, but with a grim sense of finality. It was even clearer than he had hoped. He saved the video file to a thumb drive, got dressed, and drove into town. He didn't go to City Hall. He went to the local police department. He walked in and asked to speak to the chief, a man he knew well. He calmly explained the situation, outlining the months of harassment that culminating in the events of the previous night. Then, he plugged the thumb drive into the chief's computer. They watched the video together in silence. When it was over, the chief leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "that's about as open and shut as it gets. Trespassing, attempted vandalism. She's in a world of trouble." Frank filed a formal police report. He wasn't pressing charges out of anger. He was doing it as a final, necessary step in a long, methodical process. Mary had crossed the line from a civil dispute into criminal activity. And for that, there had to be legal, official consequences. The days leading up to the demolition were strangely quiet. Mary seemed to have vanished. Her megaphone lay silent. There were no more tirades or drive-by glares. The 30-day deadline on the demolition order was about to expire, and she had made no arrangements to have the work done. As per the ordinance, the city had now contracted the job out to a local marine construction company. The date was set. Meanwhile, the police had everything they needed. The district attorney had already approved the charges based on the video evidence. The police chief told Frank they were simply waiting for the right moment to make the arrest, a moment that would minimize any potential for a dangerous confrontation. The entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the tense, electric calm before a thunderstorm. Everyone knew the final act of the drama was about to unfold. They were all just waiting for the curtain to rise. Frank, for his part, went about his days with a placid resolve. He had set all the pieces in motion. Now, he just had to watch them fall. Demolition day dawned bright and clear. The air was crisp, and the lake was like glass. At 8:00 a.m. sharp, the low thrum of a diesel engine echoed across the water. A large barge, carrying a towering yellow crane and a crew of 4 men in hard hats, chugged slowly toward Mary's property. It was a slow, deliberate procession of justice. All around the lake, porch lights flicked on. Neighbors emerged from their houses, coffee mugs in hand, settling into lawn chairs, as if gathering for a 4th of July parade. This was the show they had been waiting for. The public culmination of a private reign of terror. Mr. Henderson was on his porch, giving Frank a solemn thumbs up across their lawns. The Rodriguez family was watching from their kitchen window, Maria holding her youngest child up to see. It was a community moment, a collective witnessing of the end of an era. The barge's engine cut out as it positioned itself just offshore from Mary's crumbling dock. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. The silence was shattered as Mary's front door flew open. She burst out of the house, a wild-eyed fury, dressed in the same pink tracksuit she'd worn for her first tirade. "Get off my property!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with rage. She scrambled down her lawn to the water's edge, waving her arms frantically at the crew on the barge. "You have no right. I will sue every last one of you." The foreman, a big man with a weathered face, simply looked at her, then at the official work order on his clipboard. "Ma'am, we have a legal order from the city to be here. Please stand back." Her response was to charge toward the shoreline, attempting to physically block the space where they would need to work. She was completely unhinged, a cornered animal making its last futile stand. This was the scene Frank had witnessed in his mind's eye so many times. This was the moment of reckoning. This was the climax. And just as he had planned, it wouldn't be his voice that answered her rage. It would be the calm, authoritative voice of the law. Frank walked out of his back door and down the gentle slope of his lawn. He didn't go toward Mary or the demolition crew. He simply walked to the end of his own sturdy, beautiful dock, the source of this whole affair. He held his favorite coffee mug, the one his daughter had given him that said, "World's best dad," though today it might as well have said, "World's most patient mayor." He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just stood there, a silent observer, his very presence a testament to the fact that her campaign of intimidation had failed. His calm was a stark contrast to her hysteria, his solid dock a rebuke to her rotting one. Seeing him there, watching her downfall with such placid detachment, seemed to break something in her. Her rage, which had been directed at the crew, now swiveled to him. "You!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You did this to me. I'll destroy you." She took a step towards his property line, her fists clenched, her face a terrifying snarl of hatred. Just as Mary's foot crossed the invisible property line, the quiet crunch of tires on the gravel road announced a new arrival. 2 Lakeside Police Department cruisers, which had been parked discreetly just around the bend, pulled up in front of Mary's house. Their lights weren't flashing. Their approach was calm, professional, and utterly inevitable. 2 officers got out, their expressions firm but impassive. They had their arrest warrant, and now, thanks to Mary's latest outburst and her attempt to physically interfere with the demolition crew, they had even more cause. They walked calmly down the lawn toward her. The foreman on the barge saw them, tipped his hard hat, and had his crew stand down for a moment, giving the officers space to do their work. The entire neighborhood watched in rapt silence. The moment of truth had finally arrived, not with a bang, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of 2 uniformed police officers walking across a manicured lawn. "Mary Fitzwilliam?" the lead officer said, his voice polite but firm, cutting through her tirade. She spun around, her eyes wide with shock. "You are under arrest for trespassing and attempted vandalism based on a complaint filed on the 17th of this month." He gestured back toward the demolition foreman. "You are also being charged with interfering with a lawful city operation and, based on what I just heard, making criminal threats." Mary stared at him, her mouth agape. "You can't arrest me," she stammered, the fury momentarily replaced by disbelief. "I am the president of the HOA. I know the governor. I'll have your jobs." The officers were unmoved. As the second officer moved to cuff her, she tried to pull away, her final act of defiance. The officers, well-trained and patient, subdued her quickly and professionally. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, a collective, almost imperceptible sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the watching neighbors. The tyrant was in chains. The reign was officially over. As the officers escorted a still shrieking Mary up the lawn and placed her in the back of a squad car, the demolition foreman on the barge gave a signal to his crane operator. With a hydraulic hiss, the crane's massive claw arms swung over Mary's rotting dock. The engine revved, and the claw descended, closing around the outermost section of the structure with a deafening crunch of splintering wood. The crane lifted, and with a sound like a giant tearing a tree in half. The first piece of the dock was ripped free from its rotted pilings and swung through the air. From his vantage point, Frank watched the police car pull away, its lights now silently flashing. At the exact same moment, the first load of debris from Mary's dock was dropped onto the barge with a final, shuddering crash. It was perfect. Poetic justice. Her downfall, driven away by the law. And the symbol of her hypocrisy, his being dismantled, piece by piece. He took a final, slow sip of his now cold coffee. The war was over. And he had won. In the immediate aftermath, a profound sense of peace settled over the neighborhood. The grinding, splintering sounds of the demolition, which lasted for the rest of the day, were not a nuisance. They were the sounds of healing. It was the sound of a cancer being removed. As the crew finished and the barge chugged away, leaving nothing but a few bare pilings sticking out of the water like broken teeth, the neighbors spontaneously started to emerge from their homes. Someone brought out a portable grill. Another brought a cooler of drinks. An impromptu neighborhood barbecue started on the lawn between Frank's and Mr. Henderson's properties. People were laughing, sharing stories not just of Mary's reign, but of their lives, their kids, their jobs. They were reconnecting in a way they hadn't felt free to do for years. Mr. Henderson walked over to Frank, clapping him firmly on the shoulder. "You didn't just pull up a weed, son," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. "You replanted the whole garden." "Afraid." The legal and financial fallout for Mary was swift and severe. She was facing criminal charges, which she eventually pleaded down to misdemeanors that left her with a criminal record, probation, and a hefty fine. The city, meanwhile, billed her for the full cost of the demolition and disposal, a bill that ran into the tens of thousands of dollars. Then came the fines for her other code violations, which had been accruing daily. On top of all that, the newly emboldened HOA board, under fresh leadership, launched an audit. They uncovered the embezzlement that the accountant neighbor had suspected and filed a civil suit against her to recover the stolen funds. Buried under an avalanche of legal fees, city fines, and civil judgments, Mary was ruined. Within 6 months, a for sale sign was hammered into her perfect lawn. She was forced to sell the house she had lorded over for so long just to stay solvent. She left town not with a bang, but with the quiet shame of a U-Haul truck loaded in the dead of night. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. The family who bought Mary's house was a young couple with 3 noisy, happy kids. One of the first things they did was build a huge wooden swing set in the backyard, not far from where Maria Rodriguez's had once been. The new HOA board, led by a council of reasonable, community-minded residents, immediately went through the bylaws, striking out the petty, vindictive rules Mary had implemented. The fine for an unacceptable bird feeder was the first to go. Neighborhood barbecues became a regular summer event. People started talking to each other again, helping each other with yard work, and borrowing cups of sugar. The fear and suspicion that had poisoned the atmosphere for so long had evaporated, replaced by a genuine sense of community. The entire social fabric of their little corner of the lake had been rewoven, stronger and more vibrant than before. It was a testament to the idea that one person's courage could inspire a wave of positive change. Months later, Frank sat on his dock, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The cedar had weathered to a soft, silvery grey, and the structure felt as permanent and solid as the ground beneath his house. He reflected on the chaotic events of the past year. It had never really been about his dock, he realized. The dock was just the catalyst. It was about principle. It was about the fundamental difference between rules designed to build a community up and rules twisted to tear people down. Mary saw laws and bylaws as weapons, tools to exert control and feed her own ego. Frank, the engineer, saw them as a foundation, a framework upon which a safe, fair, and functional society could be built. He hadn't sought revenge. He had sought order. He had simply insisted that the rules, the real ones, apply equally to everyone, even those who believed they were queens, and in doing so, he had restored not just the peace, but the integrity of his community. Life on the lake returned to a new, better normal. The sound of children's laughter now regularly drifted across the water. Frank found himself busier than ever, not with mayoral duties, but with neighborly ones. He helped the new family in Mary's old house fix a leaky sprinkler system, lending them his tools and his expertise. He spent an afternoon with Mr. Henderson, helping him repair the section of his lawn that had been damaged by the erosion from Mary's illegal retaining wall. He was no longer just the mayor or the retired engineer. He was Frank, the neighbor, a respected part of a community that was finally healing and growing together. He had faced down a bully not by lowering himself to her level, but by raising the standards for everyone. He had fought a war of attrition and won, not with anger, but with patience, precision, and an unshakable belief in the system he had sworn to uphold. In the end, the story of Mary's dock became a local legend, a cautionary tale about arrogance and the abuse of power. It served as a powerful reminder that the foundations of a community are not built on intimidation and fear, but on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the rules. Sometimes, to fix a deep-seated problem, you can't just patch it over. You have to be willing to tear the whole rotten structure down, right to its foundation, and build something new, something better, in its place. Frank Miller had come to the lake to build a dock, but he had ended up rebuilding a community. And as he sat there, feeling the solid cedar planks beneath him, and watching the last light fade from the sky, he knew, with the certainty of a well-built bridge, that this was the most important project he had ever undertaken.